Hello, Flat Earth researchers, debaters and debunkers. Anti-flat earthers and stubborn defenders of the globe will often single-mindedly claim that the angles at which we view celestial objects, especially the sun, are definitive proof that we are on a spinning ball Earth orbiting a massive sun. These so-called proofs that we are living on a spinning sphere by looking at the sky rather than attempting to measure any actual curvature across the surface of the Earth range from the famous Eratosthenes experiment, which was apparently carried out about 2,000 years ago by measuring the shadows cast by a stick in the ground and down a well, to make the claim that we are on a curved surface moving around a very much larger sun, and a distant one at that. And we have the claims that the equinox is proof of the heliocentric model and a massive sun, because we can see the sun rise in the east and then set directly in the west from any location either side of the equator and on the equator. We are taught as irrefutable fact that this happens twice a year, once on the spring equinox on March the 20th, and then again on September the 22nd for the autumn equinox, because of the Earth's axial tilt as it orbits the sun. It's called the equinox because we get an equal division of day and night of about 12 hours. It also assumes that because the sun is so massive and the Earth much, much smaller in comparison, that we get parallel rays of sunlight hitting the Earth, giving us the ability to see the sun rise in the east and then set in the west from any location on the globe Earth. However, this is just one compartmentalized interpretation and conclusion of the many that we can make from the observations that we can all make to arrive at a variety of theories and conclusions about what we are on and what is actually moving and where it's going. Even Einstein is reported to have said that observations of the sky alone cannot lead us to conclude whether the sun or the Earth is moving, for example. My own research has led me to believe that the heliocentric model is nothing more than an interpretation of the Gregorian calendar, which of course is based on a solar year, putting the sun at the center of the calendar and then attempting to tell us that this is our physical reality with a sun at the center of our solar system. However, there are many cultures across the Earth that use a lunar calendar, which also works perfectly fine for telling the time throughout the year. We still get a very similar cycle. Yes, you can use geometry to illustrate this passage of time with circles, and assuming that the Earth is a globe and that it is moving around the sun. We could also assume that the sun is moving around a globe and the globe is stationary. Or we can assume that the Earth is flat and the sun and moon are orbiting the Earth above it. The point is that all any of us can do is keep time by observing the cosmic clock and interpret it in any way we see fit. Of course, it is the globalists who wish to control world trade and most of the world's population or human resources, who wish to impose the heliocentric model and the Gregorian calendar as our timekeeping method upon us. So while we have adamant defenders of the globe making these observations of the equinox to say that it is proof that we are living on a globe, they are actually ignoring what the moon does. And the moon actually does a very similar thing to the sun during the time of the equinox. Bearing in mind that what we see in the sky is a sun and a moon of a similar size and what appear to be similar distances from the Earth. Yet we are told that the Sun is 93 million miles away and many, many more times larger than the Earth, while the Moon is about 250,000 miles away and much, much smaller than the Earth. This is the only time that globe defenders will use perspective to defend their argument, telling us that they appear to be the same size because the Sun is much further away. Again, there is no denying that we can all make the same observations of the Sun rising in the east and setting in the west, for example, but that in no way dictates that it is a proof that we are on a spinning ball. It is just one interpretation. And we will see now that this so-called fact that the Sun is massive and very far away while the Moon is very close and much smaller than the Earth is nothing more than assumptions to fit the heliocentric model. In fact, some of the so-called scientific methods we are told we can use to judge or estimate the size of the Sun and distance to it as well as the Moon is to hold up a coin in front of our face and measure the distance between our face and the coin and then calculate the distance and size of the Sun. Or we can use pinhole cameras. These are very crude methods which are not really scientific and in no way physically measure the actual distance to the Sun and the Moon or the sizes of those celestial objects. So these are all guesstimates and they are all based on the assumption that we are in a solar system or heliocentric model standing on a spinning globe Earth. Anyway, let's have a look at timeanddate.com, where we can confirm that we can see the Sun rise in the east and set in the west from north of the equator or south of the equator and on the equator. We'll start with Stockholm, quite far north of the equator in Sweden, and look at the sunrise, sunset and day length in March for the spring equinox. If we go down to the 20th here, we can see that we do in fact get about 12 hours of sunlight and that it does rise in the east, doesn't go very high in the sky and then sets directly opposite in the west. So that's confirmed for Stockholm. Let's now go to Phuket, which is not far from the equator. In March, down to the 20th of March right here, and again we have about 12 hours of sunlight or daylight, just a few minutes less than we had in Stockholm, and again we do have a sunrise in the east, a much higher sun in the sky at midday, and then setting directly opposite again in the west. So that is confirmed for the Sun on the equator or near the equator. And if we then go to Punta Arenas in Chile, which is about as far south as we can go for the sunrise, sunset and day length observations, and go down to the 20th of March, again we see about the same length of day as we did in Phuket, 12 hours and 6 minutes, and again it is rising in the east and setting in the west, but we do have a very low sun at midday in comparison to what we saw in Phuket. So yes, we can confirm that the equinox gives us a sun that rises in the east and sets in the west all over the world. But when we compare these observations of the Sun during the equinox, which are alleged to prove the heliocentric model, with observations of the Moon in the same locations during the same period, we get results which completely abolish the idea that we are on a globe spinning around a massive Sun. We can also throw out the idea of axial tilt when we see that the Moon is rising and setting in here, for example, on the 4th of March, it's rising in the east and setting in the west, just as the Sun does. And then it goes on to rise in the southeast and set west-southwest. And then again during the period of the equinox, or 2 days before, we have what appears to be a lunar equinox, with the moon rising in the east and setting directly opposite in the west, rising at 6:58, nearly 7 o'clock in the morning, and setting at 20 past 8, so it's visible in the sky for about 13 hours. Here between the 24th and the 25th, we have the clocks going forward 1 hour. This is again related to the Gregorian calendar and following the sun rather than the moon, and so adjustments have to be made to make it all fit into a nice geometric circle to measure 1 year of time. But what happens here on the full moon on the 31st of March is another lunar equinox, with the sun rising here at 1917 and being visible in the sky until 6:50 in the morning, so at least 12 hours there, and rising and setting east and west just as the sun does. So that's in Stockholm. If we now go to Phuket, Thailand again, and we go down to the equinox, we can see here that above Phuket the moon is rising and setting again in the east and in the west, from the 16th until the 20th, the day of the equinox, and we are getting at least 12 hours, about 12 and a half hours of the moon being visible in the sky in this period during the new moon at the time of the equinox. And then again for the full moon on the 31st, we have the moon rising in the east at 18:35 and setting about 12 hours later at 6:11 in the morning, directly opposite in the west. So again, the moon is doing what the sun does. It is a lunar equinox, as it were. And now let's go all the way down south to Punta Arenas in Chile to see what kind of results we get there. And again, 2 days before the equinox, we have the same thing, the moon rising in the east and setting directly opposite in the west, just as the sun does. It is not going very far above the horizon, and it's visible from 8:39 in the morning until 8:51 in the evening. So again, just over 12 hours that the moon is visible in the sky, just as the sun is during the equinox. And here again we have on the 30th and the 31st, for the full moon, the moon rising in the east and setting in the west, not going very high above the horizon from this location down south, but we are getting a similar time frame of about 12 hours, rising at 8 o'clock in the evening and setting at about 10 to 8 in the morning, directly opposite to where it rose. So there we go. There is something that is never looked at, because the focus for the heliocentric model has always been on the sun. But what we can see and conclude from this is the moon is doing something very, very similar to the sun. Both of these celestial objects are behaving in very similar ways, and it really doesn't appear to be anything to do with one being more distant or than the other, or one being smaller or larger than the other. Remember that we are told that we are going around a massive sun, but the moon is going around us. But here we can see that the sun and the moon both appear to be working in tandem, but also working independently as well on their separate paths above the flat Earth. So on a final note, if you are new to this, you might find this information quite unbelievable and incredible to think that people can even contemplate the idea that we are not on a spinning ball Earth, and that the surface that we are on is in fact a flat plane. But please do look at my previous videos and observations of the sun and moon, as well as all the other very valuable work done by dedicated flat Earth researchers out there. Thank you very much indeed.